This is the ultimate question. What phone should I buy? At around $300 and sometimes less, this phone is a neutral and safe way to get into the 5G space. But we still have to find out if it's worth it. Should you buy the Samsung Galaxy A51 5G in 2021? Hello everyone, this is Matt from Railworld Review. Check out the social media listed above if you want to talk tech, and subscribe if you want to continue watching tech. Let's get started. This large feeling screen is what draws many people to this phone, and the A-series phones in general. This is a standard screen, really, being a 6.5-inch flat 1080p OLED display. It comes with some interesting choices, being a 60Hz refresh rate, as well as having a maximum of around 450 nits peak brightness, with the last interesting choice being an in-screen fingerprint scanner, as well as a hole punch for the camera. It sounds like a lot to unpack, but this is effectively the same thing that we get on a Samsung S20 FE minus the 90Hz refresh rate. As usual, we are given double tap to wake and sleep, as well as having the always nice to see, always on display. Coming from a budget or similar phone, that 60Hz refresh rate might not matter to you, but it definitely feels like it slows down the phone. It's honestly interesting to see how this was the norm for many years. But besides that, images look really nice actually, and surprisingly bright thanks to that Samsung panel. It could always be better, but image-wise, this is very close to flagship level, especially when you're using it for YouTube or other social media consumption. But after this, the phone changes. Unlike the very similar Samsung A51, the 5G model is actually dramatically different. First of all, the screen is the same, but they're not compatible with each other, meaning that you can't just buy an A51 screen and put it on the 5G model. It has to be specifically made for the 5G model, and vice versa. It's really a stupid idea when its predecessor, the A50, had the same screen as the A30, even though the A30 didn't have an in-screen fingerprint scanner. But where the screen sits is actually very different. The frame that goes around the phone is actually aluminum, whereas the A51 is plastic. This is actually a nice premium touch for the mid-range nature of this phone. The back is still crackable plastic, just like the A20, A50, and Samsung Note 20. I know it makes sense because it's a mid-range phone, but I know they saved like $1 per phone as opposed to using glass. On the right side we get the volume buttons as well as the power button, and on the bottom we get a USB-C 2.0 port, as well as the only loudspeaker and headset jack, probably for that reason. The speaker itself is good, sounding pretty reasonable, but lowers the phone's appeal when listening to music or videos in landscape mode. As for the USB-C port, the 2.0 option isn't that big of a deal, but the charging speeds are confusing to me. Samsung claims just fast charging, while some people say that it's 15 watts or 25 watts. Personally, the highest I've seen this charge at was 15 watts, so take that how you want. Then on the top we have the SIM and SD card tray, the latter always being a welcomed addition. The addition of headset jack and SD card slots being reserved for non-flagship phones will never make sense to me. Overall, I like the design of this phone. It is slightly large because of the screen size, but has a decently light feel to it thanks to that plastic back. But it is still somewhat durable thanks to that metal frame. But now we have to travel inside of the phone. Being a 5G phone, it is safe to expect decent speed to accompany this phone, which is true. Samsung put an Exynos 980 in this phone, paired it with 6GB of RAM and 128GB of UFS 2.0 storage. Some sites I saw said that it was 2.1, but I'm getting speeds similar to 2.0, so that's what I'm going to say it is. When I started using this phone, I was getting pretty decent performance. I mean, it was pretty much what you would expect out of a mid-range phone. However, after a couple weeks of using this phone, I started to notice that this phone was slowing down, getting hung up on things, and even dropping in cellular performance. Mind you, the cell performance drops were in low signal areas, giving me no signal, rather than a little bit of signal. Still, I was able to get some nice 5G speed tests out of this phone. And they even make a 5G ultra-wideband version of this phone if you bought it from Verizon or Spectrum. We also get Android 11 out of this phone, with Android 12 being promised eventually. Performance is similar to a Snapdragon 765 chip, but a little bit slower, obviously. Graphics is on par with a Snapdragon 845 chip, which is kind of surprising. Overall, this chip is very close to the Samsung S9 non-American variant, which is good and bad. Like I said, the phone does have some interesting things like an SD card slot as well as a headset jack. Okay, not too interesting, but I am just reminding you that they exist, albeit in an outdated way. Like I said earlier, on the bottom we get the USB-C port that's running at 2.0 speeds, which is alright if you don't need to transfer stuff to this phone. But this port does send power to the 4500 mAh battery, which lasts all day, but isn't really the best. I think the processor isn't the most efficient one out there because this cell should work fine for the design. Then we have to remember this is a mid-range 5G phone, so there's no water resistance or wireless charging, most likely to save money on certification, because there's lots of examples of why the former could almost exist in this phone, but doesn't. The last thing I'll talk about are the cameras, which are good. Honestly, I'm not a fan of the little ones, which are decent, one being a 5 megapixel depth sensor while the other is a 5 megapixel macro lens. They're better than the truly useless 2 megapixel sensors you'll see in other phones, but they're also not really needed. Then we get a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera, which is actually fairly good. We're also given a 48 megapixel wide sensor, which shoots at 12 megapixels normally, or 48 megapixels if you choose that option. This is actually a good camera for the style of this phone. It's nice to see these sensors in a Samsung phone because you know that it won't be the best, but they definitely won't be absolute garbage like you would see in other mid-range phones. We are limited to 4K at 30 frames per second video, but we can switch to ultra-wide and back while recording, but you clearly don't want to do that. The front camera does do 4K at 30 frames per second video as well, which is pretty cool. It is a fixed focus 12 megapixel sensor, which doesn't really make sense because a 12 or even a 10 megapixel sensor would have accomplished all the stuff that this 32 megapixel sensor can do, and would probably look better. As for all of the cameras, they are able to capture night shots, but it doesn't really mean they're going to look the best. Stabilization is decent using electronic stabilization because none of these sensors have optical image stabilization, which never really makes sense to me even in budget or mid-range phones. But overall, this phone has pretty good specs, but it is strange to see the usage start out good and drop over a couple of weeks. Kind of like how some stores have a return policy of 2 weeks, and after 15 days, everything starts to go downhill. Which brings me to my last section, what these phones sadly are. I did mention that this phone has good performance, but for someone like me, this phone is kind of disposable. I use flagship phones most of the time, so I'm used to the top of the line performance, but I wanted to use this phone because it actually intrigued me. But for me, this is somewhat of like a $200 phone experience, not a $500 new phone. I would say the 2020 iPhone SE is better than this phone, although not by much. This all-screen design is cool, the cameras are good, and the performance for the most part is adequate. I mean, I did end up using this phone for almost a month, so it's not the worst. But then we come to the person that doesn't care about the latest and greatest. If you're that type of person, this phone may be for you, but beware. I say this phone is disposable for a few reasons, but let's talk about the most important thing that would go against my point. Repairability. Sure, the back is plastic and probably cheap to fix, but it can crack, somehow. Batteries are batteries and will need to be replaced eventually and can be found for about $20 or so. So that's not the issue. But what about breaking the screen? Now, a quick search on Amazon will bring you to a $170 part to fix this. Kind of expensive for a phone that you're financing for $21 a month or that you bought used for like $300. Not to mention the labor for this if you don't install it yourself. Then we have the option for a newer model, the A52 5G, which is better and worse. For some reason, the processor is actually lower in most benchmarks. Not really sure what happened there. Still at $500, you get a 64 megapixel sensor over the 48 megapixel sensor in the A51 5G, as well as proper IP67 rating for water resistance. Then you trade the metal frame for the plastic frame, but you get a smooth 120Hz refresh rate out of that A52. But that's the plan. The idea is to keep this phone for a year and upgrade the next year. So ultimately you would be paying $1,000 for two phones, which is something you could have done with like the S21 and even saved $200. But you can always break the cycle and stick with the good old A51 5G. So should you buy this phone in 2021? If you can find this phone for around $300, I would say go for it. The screen is really nice even though it lacks a high refresh rate, but everything else looks pretty good. I can see this phone still lasting someone a year or so, if not longer, as long as you don't plan to game on this phone or do all that extra stuff. While it's supposed to be close to something like a Pixel 5 performance-wise, the phone isn't optimized to its full potential. but this phone is still getting software updates and will continue doing so until at least mid-2022. At least that's what I'm guessing. And that's my review of the Samsung A51 5G, the 5G phone that fits most people's hands and budget. But what do you think? Should I stick to reviewing some lower end phones or mid-range phones, or should I just stick to the flagship ones? Let me know in the socials listed above, and as always, thanks for watching.